Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Doubly so if you're hoping I'd follow up on my review of Kaigan Games' Simulacra and tackle its sequel, Simulacra 2. Like its predecessor, it's an investigative visual novel with some puzzle-solving elements. That said, it does beg the question, did this digital doppelganger manage to improve on the original, or was this Simulacra a shoddy spare? I'm your host Arlyeon. Let's find out together. Meet Maya Crane, a young up-and-coming fitness influencer on Chimera, and the subject of the most recent case to arrive at the West Bandrika precinct. An open and shut incident, according to the coroner. Simply natural causes. And yet there's something off. Details in the report simply don't add up, which is enough to coax the resident crackpot detective, Murillo, to begin digging a little deeper. He's seen the signs before, stepped headlong into the strange. But he can't go it alone, which is why he finds himself enlisting help from either a rookie recruit at the precinct or a journalist hungry for a new scoop. As far as the execution of the narrative goes, Simulacra 2 will feel fairly similar to a veteran of the series, as the investigation of their victim's phone will see them piecing together the story from Maya's chat logs, emails, their social media history, as well as dialogues with a number of other characters. This also includes thematic similarities as well, as it strives to maintain an air of mystery and slow burn horror, while also littering the path there with a fair amount of dark humor. And to its credit, I think it does a decent job of it. The mystery elements work quite well because this time around you're provided an array of possible suspects early on, leaving you with the arduous task of tracking down all the evidence and piecing things together from their dialogue and clues, which is then made all the more tense as the investigation escalates and additional horror elements begin to creep in. That said, I was especially impressed at the development of the humor this time around. In Simulacra 1, there were some fairly funny bits, but a chunk of it was simply because of how one of the central characters was almost a parody. This time, however, when the characters are presented as playing things up, it's done a bit more purposefully, tying into the false images they cultivate as influencers. Overall, it feels a bit more like satire this time around, if we don't count our returning legacy character, Detective Murillo. Simulacra practically speedruns, shifting my perspective of him from a hard-boiled detective to a technologically inept boomer, and I'm fine with it. Incidentally, you may have noticed that I haven't overly talked about the differences between the detective and journalist stories, and that's because they're a bit more minor than you'd expect. Simply put, while they both do have unique intro scenes to introduce you into the thick of things and dialogue options from there, they don't actually feel drastically different from each other insofar as execution. Different dialogue options cropped up, but at least in the course of several playthroughs, I didn't come across any character scenario-centric choices that put me on majorly different plot paths. Instead, the plot permutations were focused around the clues I'd managed to find, as well as the manner in which I'd handled conversations with sources and suspects. Which, at least insofar as my first playthrough, was rather poor. It's not that I wasn't thorough in finding things either. I actually found a veritable plethora of optional evidence to open up additional dialogue. That said, just because you unlock a different dialogue option or can point out something to an NPC doesn't necessarily mean you should. Which is how I wound up bumbling into a perfectly disastrous capstone for my first playthrough. Thankfully, beating the game grants you access to the rapid mode so you can zip through dialogue segments and screw up in brand new ways. I emphasize screw up because there are a lot of bad endings to bumble into, which might seem a little daunting until you cozy up to another pair of sequel-centric innovations. See, Simulacra 2 still auto-saves at set points, but this time you have multiple checkpoint slots, which lets you double back and try different options or poke around. Something which works rather neatly with the unlockable story map. See, once you clear the game, you're given access to a map which not only showcases the choices you've made during the current route, it also highlights the one you've made in prior routes and traces out which decisions or plot points they're tied to in order to facilitate finding what you need for the golden ending, or simply to seek out all its secrets. It's genuinely neat, honestly, and something that works quite well given that the Simulacra sequel plays out a bit more smoothly when compared to its predecessor. Execution-wise, it's still very much a similar experience, being a visual novel of sorts with a focus on puzzle solving to advance the story, and yet there's a few key differences this time around. For one thing, it's less minigame-centric, eschewing the garbled messages and photo fixing from its predecessor, and replacing them with the simple utility of the Warden system. Notably, the Warden system serves as an archive of sorts, allowing you to take screenshots of plot-pertinent clues, and then later on use them as potential dialogue options. What's more, they can also double as keys to certain corrupted files, recovering them provided you can find a piece of evidence that fulfills its specific criteria, and thus granting you access to its contents. All in all, it's fairly simple to grasp, and certainly helped to motivate me to thoroughly search everything. Warden's utility hardly ends there, however, as it also serves as a sort of police database search engine, something which is tied rather neatly into a number of the game's puzzles. Still, your hurdles aren't simply limited to those. There are additional elements to navigate, like figuring out how to get a hold of certain leads, or solving elements like passwords, which provide some interesting alternatives and prevented things from simply being a data entry simulator. Admittedly, the true ending's lead-up and finale does introduce some novel elements to the mix, but I'd really rather not spoil things for you folks. Which means it's time to move on to the aesthetics, and I do have to say, coming to this game after the first one was a treat. Visually speaking, the FMV segments were a lot of fun, and the overall look of the game, both for the UI as well as the screwier details of the game, were a spectacle. That said, if I really do need to gush about something, it's the audio. Like I said in the story segments, I think the voice acting's well done, and it's notably interesting to hear the difference between the characters playing things up for their audience as influencers versus the more personal messages they send to each other or you. The music's great too, both in regards to the thematic pieces that crop up over the course of the playthrough, as well as the ones that you can queue up with the music player, one of which may have caused me to cackle.
I love my car. You know how much I love my car? That's how much.
Who you messing with? Who you playing with? 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 I'm the best.
Even the sound design is pretty solid, since I once again found myself getting trolled by certain subtle noises during the entirety of the playthrough. Which is why, all in all, I think it does a decent job at accomplishing what it set out to do. As I've said before in earlier reviews, I like a good story, and Simulacra 2 provides just that. As far as detective story goes, I like that the mystery kept me guessing until near the end, and didn't leave me feeling cheated. At the end of the day, the signs and clues were there, I just failed to connect them until it was far too late. I also think the streamlined mechanics served it well, helping to keep things focused on digesting the story beats and clues. Just ignore the fact that I got stuck on a certain puzzle for like 30 minutes because the answer to what someone considered the greatest gift was just so fucking insipid. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is, if you enjoy horror games or mysteries, I'd say Simulacra 2 is worth giving a gander. I had a lot of fun with it, and even now I'm still a bit curious about seeing what other permutations or odd little story paths I might be able to stumble into. Suffice to say, I think it's a hit, and definitely worth checking into. Enough so that I'm also eager to sink my teeth into the upcoming / just recently released third game, Simulacra 3. Partly because I'm curious if there'll be any small cameos connecting it to this one, given eagle-eyed investigators may notice a few familiar names and small cameos, and an uncanny situation which references the first game. Any which way. Thanks for tuning in! If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, or even a game to suggest for me to cover, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, to bring interviews to indie devs, and just gaming content in general, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other member of Crit Hit, Hop instead of Jump. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.